Let's start this broadcast, and I'm going to be doing one on the topic of disagreements between believers. And you know how disagreements and even sometimes parting ways doesn't mean we stop loving each other as fellow believers or wishing the best for one another in the faith. And so I'm going to start reading from Acts 15, verse 36, all the way to 41. And so we see, sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preached the word of the Lord to see how they were doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement, they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left. He, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So we see these two men. Well, let's first start with Barnabas. Let's give a little bit of an explanation on him. His name actually means son of encouragement. So Barnabas was a very compassionate, feely type of guy. He was someone who had compassion, and I just sense from reading, and knowing what Barnabas means, the name Barnabas means, that he was more of a emotional feeler type of person. But Paul, on the other hand, was a more logical, practical man. He was a very bold, lion-like. He was very, very, very much two different personality types. And we oftentimes, as believers, as people in general, there's like feelers, and then there's really deep thinkers, and then there's different personality types, and sometimes these personality types can butt heads. It doesn't mean that we are any less of a person than this other one. There's personality types over here, and then there's personality types over here. No personality type is better than the other. They're just different. And so we see these two men had very different personality types, and they just didn't see eye to eye on this matter. And so, what had happened is John Mark had ended up not sticking with the ministry, and he ditched them. And so Paul's like, well, we gave you a chance and you kind of let us down, so we're not going to have you accompany us on this next journey we take. But Barnabas, on the other hand, wanted to give John Mark kind of a second chance. He wanted to give him some grace. And which both Paul's mindset and Barnabas's mindset, neither one of them was necessarily wrong. They just had a different take on the situation. They just had a different idea on how to solve that problem. Paul, who was thinking on terms of like, what is practical, what is wise here, what if he does it to us again? Should we give him a second chance only to let him let us down? Okay, and we've all had that thought run through our mind, of course. But then, also Barnabas's mindset was like, okay, well, shouldn't we show him a little bit of grace? Shouldn't we, show grace like the Lord shows us grace? Probably that was running through his mind. And so both thoughts are biblical. But, on the same token, they had a disagreement on how the situation was to be handled. And so, you see, they ended up parting ways. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left. Commended by the believers in the grace of the Lord, he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening churches. So we see in their parting of ways, they both, in a sense, still kept producing fruit where they went. They still kept doing the work of the Lord. It's not like they totally parted ways and one left the faith and the other didn't. It was just they broke away, and they weren't, as we would say, maybe in our times, when you no longer are, when you unfriend a person, when you kind of part ways, you guys don't see eye to eye, you're okay, well, we'll part ways. And, that didn't mean that they were any less believers, or either one of them was any less a disciple of Christ. It just means that they just weren't compatibly working with each other in that season of their life. And so God sometimes allows that to happen. Doesn't mean that we can't still go on doing the work of the Lord. It just means sometimes certain people we might not see eye to eye with them. They'll leave our lives. We'll continue living our lives for the Lord in the way He directs us, and they'll go their separate way, and they'll continue doing the Lord's work in the way He's calling them to live. But it doesn't mean that just because we have disagreements with each other as believers, and even if we part ways, it doesn't mean we have to have ill will towards each other. Because after all, in Christ, we're all trying to strive for the same goal. We want to see Christ preached to the world. We want to see people get saved. We want to see broken lives transformed by His grace. That's the goal of us all, I'd say, as Christians. And so, but we see these two men kind of parted their ways, and they went on and they started doing the ministry not together anymore, but they went on and did ministry in other places. And that's one of the ways the gospel spread throughout the world, is like believers would come to know Christ and they'd be dispersed throughout, and they'd go share the gospel in their own little sphere of influence where they were. And sometimes they'd leave from one place and go to another, and they'd share the gospel wherever they went. And that's how the gospel really started spreading, and people got saved. And so we could say God took even this bad situation, this disagreement, this falling out between Paul and Barnabas, and God's like still doing Romans 8:28 action. God works all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. And we see that both these men loved God and were called according to His purpose. They just didn't agree with each other. They just had a disagreement. They had an argument. They parted ways. But God still loved them both, and they both loved God and were called according to His purpose. So God was still working His good plan out in each of these men's lives, and the gospel kept spreading. And so even when we have disagreements as believers, even if we part ways, even if God's call on our lives may cause us to separate and go different directions, we know that God is still wanting us to carry out the same goal and focus, to share the gospel, to spread the light of Jesus Christ, and to continue doing the work for His kingdom. And that's the important thing. And it's okay for us to disagree on some things as believers. When we have a disagreement, we don't have to leave with ill will and say, that person, I just can't believe they didn't agree with me. No, we can still trust that God will use even that kind of situation to continue furthering His goals and His purpose, and that's the beauty of God at work there. God was using both these men, even this bad situation where they fell out. It was kind of an ugly mess, but God is still like, I'm still going to use this to accomplish my purpose. And we see how that played out. Well, it says they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted companies, and Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. So, he goes that way. And Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers, by the grace of the Lord, and he sailed through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So one went this way, the other went that way, but they continued spreading the gospel as they went. And so that's the beauty of it. That is the beauty of it, is even though they parted companies, God was using each of them to accomplish His work throughout the regions they went. And so that's how awesome our God is. He can use even the bad situations, the relationships that kind of fall apart, the friendships that kind of disintegrate. He can still use that for good in our lives if we're committed to Him and we want to do His purpose. We see later on, Paul writes about John Mark. This was years later. He mentions John Mark, and he says, he mentions how he wants to have John Mark with him because he's useful in the ministry. And so, we see that Paul later on goes on to talk about that. I'll pull up the passage. In 2 Timothy 4:11, it says, and Paul is obviously probably in a dungeon at this time and in prison. Later on, nearing the later part of his life, he says, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. So we see there's kind of a shift. Paul had, after years had passed, he's kind of like, well, Mark has probably had some chance to grow and has probably matured since then. And that's what God does in our lives. The longer we walk with him, the more he matures us and grows us. And so sometimes how we behave years earlier, sometimes maybe we were a little bit more less responsible and reliable in earlier years of our Christian faith. But God has grown us to a point where we actually grow and we become more useful in that growth. And so, Paul's not looking back saying, well, only Luke is with me. He says, actually, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in the ministry. And so we see there's no trace of resentment in Paul at that point. He's forgiven Mark. He's gotten over it. He said, well, bring Mark. He's useful to me. And so we see, just because there was a parting of ways and there was a disagreement and a dispute, didn't mean they couldn't grow past it and still accomplish the work of the Lord. God bless.